I would fail to thrive on a vegan diet.
Even though I eat plant-based, I've become broader and broader in the way that I answer that. Do you think we will reach a point where genetic profiling is done and that will provide very specific recommendations?
100%. We already do it.
Is that the study of yours that's received the most media attention?
The most to date, I think we got 1.6 billion, was the Mission Mushroom. I sent mushrooms to space. The pink salts do have slightly more minerals, but they also came with milk. Is so nutritious. It's so important to get all those nutrients from dairy. Don't quit on milk.
I have to ask this. Have you ever received funding from the dairy or other food industries? Hey, it's Simon Hill. Welcome back to The Proof. Today I'm joined by Dr. Flavia Fayet-Moore, a highly respected nutrition scientist and dietitian with deep expertise in nutrient status, public health, and science communication. In this episode, we explore some of the most misunderstood areas of nutrition, from supplements and dairy to plant-based milks, fortification, and why we should all be eating more mushrooms. You'll also notice a new feature that I've introduced in this episode for the first time. From time to time, I will jump in with a short fact check, not to challenge the guest, but to offer extra content or clarification where it might be helpful. And that will be designated by this sound. One of the things I've realized is that I often reflect on these conversations after we record, and it gives me time to dig deeper into certain claims. So these quick inserts are a way to keep the conversation evolving and to make sure that you walk away with the most accurate, nuanced, clear information possible. Without further ado, let's get into it. You've worn quite a few different hats over the years. Scientist, dietitian, founder. When someone asks, what do you do professionally? How do you answer that?
It's a good question. I revert to nutrition scientist because that's what I do day to day. It's really use nutrition to help improve people's lives. My go-to is nutrition scientist, although I was recently at a conference, both at the Space Summit and a horticulture conference. And my one-liner when I meet people, when they ask, what do you do? It's really fun to say, I sent mushrooms to space. That tends to intrigue people, and then it opens the whole door in terms of what I do. But I definitely revert to nutrition scientist.
Right, so on top of that list that I reeled off there, you're also a space scientist. I have to imagine there's not too many space scientists in the world.
That's right, and not many that have actually sent a payload to space. So it's a very exciting and unique place to be in right now.
What does sent a payload to space mean?
So a payload is any type of experiment or anything that you're sending into orbit. So it's called a payload. That's, I guess, space lingo. So having an actual experiment or having sent something to space is a really unique opportunity that I guess not many scientists get to do.
What did your personal on-ramp to nutrition and dietetics look like? Why the initial interest in food and health?
It's a good question, Simon. I only recently discovered what it was. Originally, I always thought, because I've done so many sports during high school, and I was really interested in getting that edge from food. But reflecting back on my career and why I ended up doing 3 degrees in nutrition was because my mother was anorexic when I was a teenager. So growing up in Brazil, food is life, it's culture, it's the reason why I studied food. It's just it's epic and everyone has to eat and it brings so much joy. So when my mom was anorexic, I saw all that love and all that amazingness around food and culture kind of being ripped away from me. So I started researching. I started going, well, how can I bring that joy back into my mom's life? And that led to me realizing, oh my God, you can study nutrition? I couldn't believe it. I just, originally went for a biology major. And then at the time, my boyfriend at the time actually said, Flavia, all you do is talk about food. You're constantly cooking, researching. Did you know you can study nutrition? And I remember that moment so clearly. It was like an aha moment in my life where I was like, for real? Like you can actually study this? And that was the beginning of my career in nutrition science, which then led to doing a dietetics degree and then led to doing a PhD, and with all different reasons why I went through those different paths. But I absolutely love food. Everyone has to eat. And it's a decision that we have to make not only once, not twice, but multiple times a day. And it's really nice to be able to do the science to help people make those decisions.
If I recall correctly, I think you did your PhD at University of Sydney.
Correct.
What was your PhD question, or what were you interested in?
I was interested in the relationship between eating, like the behavior, the psychology of eating, and what people actually eat, and then in turn how that affects their nutritional status. So I was looking at a group, cohort of young women of childbearing age, so between 18 to 35, and I wanted to see, is there a relationship in terms of how people approach food? So if they're very restrictive, if they have a tendency to overeat at parties or when there's alcohol, and then looking at what they're actually eating, profile their diet. You know, we all know how hard and the barriers to profiling people's diet accurately. And then in turn to go, well, if they are having more iron, if they are having more zinc, how does that actually impact their nutritional status? So it's a kind of a holistic look at nutrition, but from all the different sides, not just what they're eating or what their blood status looks like. And what surprised me the most, and that was in 2006, so, you know, more than 20 years ago now, but it's that how micronutrient deficient young women were. So, and the reason for that is that we found was really because they're apparently healthy. And that's kind of the hard thing about nutrition. You look healthy, but it doesn't necessarily mean you are. Not only did they have multiple micronutrient deficiencies, but they have very disordered eating patterns. So perhaps they were removing one food group but not another. I actually tried to categorize them into different groups of vegetarianism, but we couldn't. So it'd be, you know, they don't eat eggs or chicken and fish, but they eat meat. And it was a very restrictive diet with a tendency to overeat when there are foods that are, you know, delicious, but not necessarily nutritious. So because of that constant restriction because of dieting predominantly, they weren't meeting their nutrient targets, but when they were over consuming the calories, they weren't getting foods that were nutritious. So that's kind of the pattern we saw. And fast forward 20 years, and we just published on the nutrient shortfalls in Australia and New Zealand, which is, again, multiple micronutrient shortfalls, which is really sad, right?
Was that research during your PhD, were they women just representative of the Australian public, or were they a specific subset?
It was a specific subset of university students. So these are educated women of childbearing age that will likely go on to potentially some of them to have children, right? So it was quite concerning at the time.
What were the micronutrients that these women were falling short in, despite being apparently healthy, which I think is really interesting. I think that's worth underscoring. So from the outside, these women, by, I guess, medical standards, were healthy and doing well. But when you assess their diet, they were falling short based on the recommended dietary allowance or recommended daily intake for certain nutrients.
They were falling short in the recommended daily intake of food groups, but also it resulted in shortfalls in nutritional status. So we saw iron deficiency anemia, low folate, low B12, low zinc, low selenium. It was multiple micronutrients. So it was quite a few. And it opened up my whole area. Like, I love micronutrient research. You know, it's they're kind of the unsung heroes in diets as well, because we take that for granted. A lot of the micronutrients you don't have frank deficiencies for. And a lot of them don't manifest in symptoms that are specific. And there's not a single system in the body that is not affected by nutrition. So when you start having shortfalls in the diet of specific micronutrients, it might just be one. It impacts your health and well-being 100%, but we can't see it. And that's the big problem, right? You can't see your bones becoming porous. You really need to be assessed from a nutrition and a health status perspective.
Yeah, a lot of the focus when it comes to chronic diseases is on things in the diet in excess, like saturated fat, or perhaps insufficient amounts of certain nutrients like fiber. But would you agree that some of these micronutrients, where there is a suboptimal state and perhaps not a frank deficiency though, that these are also driving increased risk of chronic disease?
Oh, 100%. So we have evidence of that. We have evidence of the specific nutrients that are associated with chronic disease risk being increased, from cardiovascular disease to type 2 diabetes, cancer. 100%. I think we're seeing, being in nutrition science for so many years, I've seen different trends, right? We are still in the macro trend. Like, I mean, how hot is protein right now? Like, we're still talking about the macros. And hopefully we're going to move into the micro sooner than later. But then we're also moving to the bioactive compounds. So especially plant bioactives and also fungi, there are thousands and thousands of them. And we really only profile maybe 100 things in food that we measure in nutrition science. So there's more than 10,000 plant compounds that we know have anti-inflammatory, anti-carcinogenic, immune modulating effects. And we still don't even know how much of them we need and in what proportions or what exactly they do. So that's why, we always revert back to whole foods whenever we can, because in that whole food matrix, you've got all those plant bioactives and you've got the micronutrients and the macros. But I really think it's time people start focusing on the micros. Because yes, macros are important. Fiber was one of the shortfall nutrients we identified in the Australian diet in New Zealand. But also there were 20 micronutrients that we identified that were lacking. So, and they all work together, right? Like, you think magnesium works with calcium, with vitamin D, with potassium for bone health. And that's just one outcome. So it's really all interrelated. And we have to focus on making sure that we're eating things that are with positive nutrition. Because we've also it's very negative. Like, how fun is it growing up in a day and age where it's like, don't have sugar, don't have this, don't eat too much. Like, it's anxiety inducing. It's not fun.
We can flip that into focusing on what do you get to add? What do you get to eat more of?
Yes. And one of the things I often say is just add one color to your life. Add one color to your plate, one color to the lunchbox, one color to your fridge, your pantry. Like, starting with very positive small messages.
Let's say you're at a dinner party and someone says, Dr. Fayet-Moore, you've been researching nutrition and health, both acute and long-term health, for a couple of decades now. What is the healthiest way to eat for energy, for mood, and for long-term health? What would your high-level answer be at a dinner table?
I'm a party pooper. My answer is, what is the ultimate car for you, not knowing anything about you? Are you a motorbike person? Are you a family wagon with 8 seats? Right? It's boring because it depends on context. What I can tell you personally for me, what the best diet is for me. But to give that type of information, I know everyone loves that. Right? They want to know the answer, but it depends on like what you can afford. What's your budget for the car? How many seats do you need to fill? How far are you traveling? Right? There's so many parts of it that depends on context that is really hard to give that answer. It depends on your disease state, et cetera, et cetera. But there's one thing that no one argues is to have lots of color and lots of plant as part of that plate is one part of a diet that no one really challenges, right? That most people can agree on from a nutrition science perspective. But as a micronutrient person as well, I think there's a very important role for animal foods if you consume them in the diet as well. And it shouldn't be disregarded along with sustainability arguments or with, other arguments that people have.
What do you think about more plant-based diets like vegetarian and vegan diets, if someone is appropriately planning, I guess, to ensure that they're getting enough of the nutrients of focus that they could, likely fall short in if they're not planning?
Yes, as long as there's the adequate planning and knowledge to eat well, it's a great diet. Every diet can be great for different people. Broadly speaking, of course, a vegetarian, or vegan diet can be extremely nutritious and health promoting. It's just important to get those micronutrients. Of course, in a vegan, there are key micronutrients that will be very difficult to get, like your long chain omega-3s, basically impossible, and of course B12. So, and it's also more difficult to get zinc and selenium and certain other nutrients. So a lot of attention needs to be paid and supplementation is required, but it's still very possible to eat well.
What would you say are some of the most frustrating or persistent nutrition myths that you keep seeing online or in the media, ones that you would, like to kind of finally put to bed?
Well, one big one for me is milk, that we shouldn't be drinking milk. Like, oh my goodness. Especially as a micronutrient researcher, milk is so nutritious, right? If you can have milk, then include milk in the diet because it has more than 10 essential nutrients. A small proportion of the population can't make the lactose as efficiently, so they avoid it altogether rather than potentially looking for lactose-free milk. Another myth that I see a lot, which was only really until recently that I thought it's a myth, is on 100% juice. So growing up in Brazil, 100% juice is very much part of the diet. There's a smorgasbord of different fruits and flavors, right? Like literally ones that probably many people haven't even heard of. So I grew up drinking juice, absolutely love it. It's minimally processed food. It's a whole food. It's got vitamins and minerals. And then I did a degree in dietetics where I was told, it's just sugars, no fiber. It doesn't make you feel full and it makes you fat. And that's really the rhetoric that many of us learned in nutrition science. And again, it's looking at macros, right? It's kind of ignoring a bit of the micronutrients and bioactives. But moving forward, we published the highest level of evidence you can possibly get on 100% juice and health. And we found that there's no association with increased weight, with insulin, with glucose from systematic literature reviews of randomized trials where they're giving them juice compared to water, most of the trials, right? So no adverse metabolic effect, no increased weight, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting is we found level B grade evidence for cardiovascular health, for C-reactive protein, for blood pressure lowering, higher level of evidence than we currently have to omit ultra-processed foods from the diet.
Higher level of evidence in support of consuming 100% juice compared to removing ultra-processed foods.
Correct. So everyone talks about how we need to omit ultra-processed foods from the diet. It's bad, 30 different diseases it's associated with. That's very low grade level of evidence in the confidence that we have that the association is true. Whereas with the juice research we did, it was actually level B, which is the second highest. In nutrition science, we hardly ever get that level of confidence with clinically meaningful reductions in blood pressure, for example. So it really changed myself as a researcher doing that science and most of us in the team, because we went, wow, it actually can be a health promoting beverage. And when you look at the balance of evidence.
Do you think it matters how that juice is made? Is it 100% juice or is it heavily refined and has added sugars?
It's definitely different, and you have to read the labels to make sure you're drinking 100% juice. So it's got to be 100% juice, not your juice with added sugars. What's interesting with juice, and the myth that I see all the time online, is that people say instead of smart swaps, right, for eating better, instead of drinking juice, eat an orange. Like, they're different needs. When you're at a restaurant and the waiter says, what would you like to drink as a beverage? You don't say, oh, I'd like a cut up orange, please. So it's important that there's context, right? Are you drinking juice instead of drinking alcohol? Are you drinking juice instead of drinking a sugar sweetened beverage, which is very clear, consistent evidence that it's bad for your health. So it's context, and that's why, and it's cheap, right? It's a cheap way to get loads of vitamins and minerals in addition to the bioactives found, for example, in oranges.
I'm chuckling a little bit because it reminds me, sometimes I get a bit of pushback from folks who are, I would say, a very purist in their approach to the consumption of fats and don't like the consumption of anything that's refined. And I get pushback around my recommendation to consume oils like olive oil. And often people will say, well, you should just eat the olives instead. And the reason I laugh is because it does overlook the application piece. You know, people are not cooking their vegetables in whole olives.
Exactly. And plus all the other benefits of helping absorb lots of fat-soluble vitamins and the added bioactives.
What do you think is the healthiest juice? Is it orange juice? Is it grape juice? Like if you were to look at micronutrient content and bioactive content?
Simon, it's like the car question again. So I guess it depends, right, on where your outcome is. So it's interesting that orange, there's actually a lot of really cool research on orange juice. There's hesperidin and naringin, two bioactive compounds that are prebiotic. They've been shown to be associated with positive cognitive benefits as well. That, of course, that wasn't in a review because our review was a systematic review of systematic literature reviews. But there's also a lot of evidence on those compounds in orange juice helping stabilize the blood glucose response post-ingestion too. So, but then you've got, I guess, looking at more of the veggie juice, beetroot juice, nitric oxide, vasodilation. It's really good for the heart as well, really rich in potassium. And so I think the best juice is the one you love. That's 100% that you're going to have every day. Like if I tell someone have cranberry juice, if they don't love it, they're not going to drink it. And food is really only nutritious if it's eaten or drunk.
Are you an orange juice with pulp or without pulp kind of gal?
I'm orange juice with pulp, but I grew up without pulp. But I kind of like the texture.
Yeah,
I guess it gives it another edge to the beverage, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm definitely an orange juice girl. But in Brazil, I drink, there's cocoa juice. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. But cocoa, which we make chocolate from, the pod has this beautiful white flesh. And that flesh is used to make juice in Brazil. Also cashew juice. So the cashew has a little stem, and that's the nut that we eat. But cashew fruit, again, has a really cool juice that you can drink, and it's delicious. So in Brazil, I drink way more juices when I visit, but unfortunately, here in Australia, the variety isn't as vast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my favorite tropical juices is guava.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Big fan of guava.
Yeah, very high in lycopene.
How do you feel as a nutrition scientist when you see nutrition information online or in the media that completely contradicts what the evidence shows?
Furious. Like back in the day, I wanted to throw something at the TV. And nowadays, you're just like, I can't break my phone. But it's infuriating, right? It's disheartening. At the same time, it makes me feel sad because there's so much great evidence that can help people feel good about the food that they're eating and actually have a meaningful effect on their health. Yet we're in this day and age where you have non-nutrition professionals communicating nutrition science as if they know what they're talking about. That's why I kind of joined social media and I'm posting more in the last couple of years because I went, well, I've got to add to that evidence. All of us nutrition professionals need to start calling those things out.
Do you have any tips for people that are consuming that information on social media? For someone who isn't trained in nutrition science, are there any things that could help them quickly identify if this claim is trustworthy?
Yes, put it into AI and ask if that person is credible in nutrition. Very quick test. That's a modern way of checking. The old way of checking is who are they? What are their qualifications? We also have biases. Each one of us have biases, and we like to take information that feeds our biases, right? So it's always important to challenge your thinking or challenge what you're hearing. Is it because you like that information and that you believe it? And you want to believe it because it's what you already do or what you already eat?
I like that reminder about confirmation bias, in that whatever questions we're going to ask and whatever logic we're going to use to kind of determine is something trustworthy or not. We should be applying that to information that we like and information that we don't like.
Exactly.
That's going to be the most objective way for us to kind of sift through all of this information that we're being exposed to, and ultimately come up with positions that are most supported by evidence, most well supported by evidence. And science is never completely certain. It's not truth with a capital T, but the whole point of the scientific method is to reduce uncertainty.
Exactly. Well said. And a reminder that nutrition science is a new science. So the first vitamin was discovered 128 years ago. Medicine's been around for thousands of years. So nutrition science is not only a new science, but it's an applied science. Unfortunately, we have the humans consuming the food, which adds a very complex, right, data point that's very hard to control for. So it's remembering that nutrition science is new. Science changes. We've seen it, and we've seen it with juice. We've seen it with eggs and heart disease. We've seen it with nuts and weight. It's unbelievable. It keeps changing, and it does. And I think we need to embrace the science when the science has changed and it's consistently in one direction and there's clear mechanisms of action. So, in remembering that the media also love headlines, they want the clickbait. So instead of being frustrated that one day nuts are good for you, the next day they're not, well, they're generally good, full stop. But it just question the headline, question the platform that you're obtaining your information from, because they want you to click, they want you to read. And often nutrition, because everyone eats and everyone can relate to it, it becomes quite sensationalized.
I think that's also another good sign when you see someone online who's providing nutrition information that has changed their mind over time. It's typically an indicator that they're objective, they have some humility, they don't have so much conviction that they're not going to change their views despite new science emerging.
Exactly. Like we did for juice. When we looked at the evidence, it was like, what? I couldn't ignore it. Like, I can't ignore it.
I want to circle back to milk more as an example of food and sustainability, because I think you mentioned that. And over the last 5 years, there's been a lot more attention on dietary patterns and the environment, and even some dietary guidelines around the world have included it in their wording of the updated dietary guidelines. As a nutrition scientist, that's I'm going to assume first and foremost interested in human health and very interested in micronutrient status. How do you balance recommendations for human health and optimizing nutrient status versus or with the health of the planet and the effect that producing certain foods has on the environment?
So first of all, planetary health and human health are interlinked, right? So although my focus is on human health, it's important to consider planetary health, because without it, we don't have human health. So we need to ensure a sustainable and nutritious food supply now and in the future to ensure human health and human survival. So how do we balance nutrition and human health with planetary health? It's really easy. You take nutrition into account in sustainability arguments. So one example, milk is perfect. So if you are looking at the nutrient density of milk, 1 glass, 250 mils, and you're looking at an alternative, might be soy milk, oat milk, almond milk, or whatever it is. If you make a sustainability argument between the two, not taking into account the nutrition density that those beverages offer, then you're missing the point. Because in order to survive and thrive, we need to get those nutrients. So if I'm not getting it from that beverage, I'm going to have to get it from somewhere else. And when you're swapping a nutrient-dense beverage for something less nutrient-dense, you've got to make up those nutrients by eating generally more food. So we need to take into account the environmental impact of growing that additional food that would be needed to support that. And this work has been done. I can't remember the name of the author who published it, but looked at nutrient density of dairy milk or cow's milk compared to all the different plant-based milks. And it was somewhere, I think soy and oat were still a little bit lower, taking into account nutrition. But on par, there were some milks that were plant-based that had a greater environmental impact than did some other plant milks and also cow's milk.
Just jumping in here again to add a bit of helpful context to Flavia's point, because this is an area where I believe nuance really matters. It's true that cow's milk contains nutrients in forms that are generally well absorbed, especially calcium and iodine. But there's also some important pieces of context to consider here, especially if you're considering choosing a plant-based milk or already do. Firstly, vitamin D isn't naturally high in cow's milk. It's typically added during processing, just like in plant-based milks. Second, the iodine in dairy milk mostly comes from iodine-fortified cattle feed or iodine-based sanitizers that are used during milking, not the milk itself. So when we compare dairy to plant-based milks, it's really less about the source and more about what's added and in what form. Here's what I recommend looking for in a plant-based milk. Calcium carbonate as the calcium source. It is well absorbed and comparable to dairy. Even tricalcium phosphate, which is what's used in Ripple, the plant-based milk that I consume, which is not a sponsor of the show, has a bioavailability that is only 3.6% less than calcium in dairy milk. And that's made up by the fact that this contains 50% more calcium than dairy per serve. Potassium iodide or potassium iodate for iodine. Personally, when it comes to iodine, I take a multivitamin with potassium iodide. It's highly bioavailable and iodine isn't included in most plant-based milks. I also check my iodine status twice a year with a urine test, and my levels, including my thyroid markers, are always at an optimal level. So I don't worry about iodine in a plant-based milk, but if you aren't getting iodine in a supplement form, then it's worth looking for a plant-based milk that adds it. If they do add it, it's usually about 20 to 30 micrograms per 100 ml. And the same goes with vitamin B12. I get that from a multivitamin, but if you don't, then buying foods that are fortified with B12, like certain plant-based milks, is certainly a good idea. And when it comes to vitamin D and plant-based milks, it's good to know that vitamin D3 is more bioavailable than vitamin D2. Just to summarize, a good plant-based milk that is equivalent to dairy milk should ideally have at least 7 to 8 grams of protein per serve, which most soy milks or milks like this Ripple pea milk do have, at least 300 milligrams of calcium per serve, and bonus points if it includes vitamin D, B12, and iodine. So yes, I actually agree with Flavia and her colleagues that not all plant milks are equivalent to cow's milk, but they can and they really should be. Well-formulated ones can absolutely stand toe-to-toe with dairy from a nutritional perspective. That's not really debated. And particularly if they're pea or soy-based, they appear to be much, much better for the environment than cow's milk, using up considerably less land, less water, and producing far less greenhouse gas emissions, even if you're comparing them based on nutrient density. All right, back to the episode. I am absolutely excited to share an exclusive offer with the Proof community. This is a limited time offer just for my audience, and no doctor referral is needed. Function Health is a comprehensive at-home blood testing service that gives you access to over 100 biomarkers, covering everything from heart, liver, kidney, and metabolic health to hormone levels, inflammation, and nutrient status. That, my friends, is 5 times more testing than the average physical. I chose Function for my own blood work and to be a sponsor of this show because they are the best in the world when it comes to helping you understand and own your health. It's true, the depth and quality of their testing is unrivaled. And as regular listeners of this show will know, you cannot optimize what you don't measure. Don't guess, test. Use function to know exactly where your health is today, and then intervene with evidence-based medicine and lifestyle changes to feel your best and reduce your risk of chronic disease. With function, you get access to very important markers like Lp(a), a genetically driven cardiovascular risk factor, ApoB, the most predictive marker of atherosclerosis, and LH and FSH, reproductive hormones typically missing from standard lab panels. It's not uncommon for these biomarkers and others to be elevated. For example, over 50% of function members have an ApoB level, and over 20% have an Lp(a) level that is above the optimal range. You can even add on harder to access tests like cystatin C, a very sensitive marker of kidney function, as well as selenium and iodine, nutrients that are essential for thyroid and overall health, yet rarely tested. So what are you waiting for? Run over to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill today and be one of 1,000 listeners to score a $100 credit. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. What are your views on nutrient fortification? Because I guess I'm thinking on the fly here, but I would have to imagine that a plant-based milk, maybe not a nut milk because nuts require a lot of water, but let's go with another plant-based milk that doesn't require so much water. And I have to imagine it uses a lot less land, produces a lot less greenhouse gases than milk. And I agree with you, milk is very nutrient dense. How do you feel about taking a plant-based milk like that and fortifying it with micronutrients? Does that end up being a more sustainable option and equivalent from a human health point of view?
It's a good question. So there are alternatives, of course, to dairy milk. There aren't equivalents, though. So that's really important to know. If you're switching, you're not going to get equivalent nutrition, but you'll get an alternative nutrition. And a lot of milks in the market nowadays aren't fortified still, especially if it's organic. It's by law, you can't fortify it. So it's important to look for fortification if you're trying to make it more equivalent to milk. But are those nutrients being fortified, adding to the environmental impact? I don't know if anyone's actually looked at that, Simon. I guess the question would be, from a pharmaceutical perspective, to make those vitamins and minerals and add them in, what is the environmental impact? Not sure anyone's actually looked at that. It's a good question. But from my perspective, it's a watery beverage, right? A lot of those nutrients like calcium phosphate, calcium is probably like the biggest added micronutrient to plant-based milk because milk is such a good source. Calcium phosphate is insoluble in water. So as soon as you put it in, it goes to the bottom of the carton. So anyone having plant-based milk that's fortified, make sure you shake that really well before you drink it, because otherwise it's really all kind of sitting at that sludge at the bottom of your carton. So, which adds another aspect of nutrition science that we've seen, that we keep learning over and over, is that fortification is important. It contributes to your total intake. So I think there's a very important role, and iron in breakfast cereal is a perfect example in children. It actually contributes quite a lot of iron to their diet. But from a nutrition science perspective, on the flip side, we know that the nutrient availability from whole foods, it's much greater generally than from supplements. And we know that the health effect of why you're consuming the micronutrient from foods is actually greater than from supplements.
Just jumping in here, I wanted to fact check this idea that micronutrients in food are always more bioavailable. A quick search revealed that this is not always the case, and in fact, it can actually be the opposite. For example, and I quote from a recent paper that looked at this, vitamin B12 added to fortified foods does not require digestion before its absorption, since it is already in a free form. Vitamin B12 status is better maintained when consuming fortified foods or a B12 supplement than from meat, fish, and other animal-based foods, end quote. And as mentioned before, calcium carbonate, often used in supplements and plant-based milks, is absorbed at a similar rate to the calcium in dairy. All right, back to the episode.
There's quite a few studies over the years that have shown this. One is a study on beta-carotene and precursor to vitamin A and vitamin E supplementation among smokers. And they were looking at lung cancer risk. So it was a prospective study. This was back then in the 90s. And they actually had to halt the study early because it increased the risk of lung cancer with supplementation.
Howdy friends, just jumping in here very quickly again to add a few extra details. Dr. Fayet-Moore is absolutely right here to reference the ATBC study from the 1990s. This was a large randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that involved over 29,000 smokers. And in this study, participants were randomly assigned to one of four groups. There was a 50 milligram of vitamin E alone group, a 20 milligram of beta-carotene alone group, and then a group that had both the vitamin E and beta-carotene supplement, and then a placebo. Importantly, the doses that were used in this study were high, about 4 times the recommended daily intake for vitamin E and twice the recommended daily intake for beta-carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A. So what did this study find? Well, firstly, they found that vitamin E supplementation alone was associated with a 34% reduction in risk of prostate cancer compared to placebo. And then secondly, as Flavia alluded to, beta-carotene alone, on the other hand, was associated with a 17% increase in lung cancer risk. Now, it's not fully understood why beta-carotene may increase the risk of lung cancer in smokers, but there are a few leading hypotheses, if we want to call them that. One is that cigarette smoke causes beta-carotene to oxidize, which then may damage lung tissue. Another is that beta-carotene improves lung function, potentially resulting in deeper inhalation of cigarette smoke and with it more carcinogens. Either way, the key point here is context. The increased risk was only observed in smokers taking high-dose beta-carotene. And in contrast, vitamin E supplementation alone was actually protective in this same group, with regards to prostate cancer risk anyway. But what about concerns that vitamin E might increase risk of cancer in otherwise healthy people? Perhaps that's something that you've heard. That's a valid question, and it brings us to the SELECT trial, another very large randomized controlled study. In SELECT, healthy men were given 400 IUs of vitamin E per day, which is equivalent to 180 milligrams, and that is around 12 times the recommended dietary intake. And in this study, the researchers observed a small but statistically significant increase in the risk of prostate cancer. What we have to appreciate here is that 12 times the recommended dietary intake is very different from taking a modest, balanced dose of vitamin E as part of a multi-nutrient. Take IM8, for example, the multivitamin that I personally use and recommend. It contains just 15 milligrams of vitamin E in a formulation that aligns with physiological needs, not megadosing. So yes, I agree that we should be cautious about high-dose single nutrient supplements, especially when taken long-term. But I do want to be clear here that we shouldn't assume that all supplementation is harmful. Formulation, dosage, and context all matter. Just because one study showed harm at a very high level doesn't mean all forms of vitamin E are dangerous or all doses, or that supplementing can't be helpful when done thoughtfully. One last point on fish oil before we get back into the episode. In the VITAL trial, a large randomized controlled trial, 1 gram per day of DHA and EPA combined was not associated with cardiovascular benefits across the entire population. And this is in line with what Dr. Fayet-Moore said about omega-3s. But, and this is crucial, in the subgroup of people with low fish intake in the VITAL study, which was defined as less than 1.5 servings of fish per week, omega-3 supplementation was associated with a 19% reduction in major cardiovascular events, also a 40% reduction in heart attacks, and a trend towards reduced all-cause mortality, that is death from any cause. So again, context is everything. The benefits of fish oil weren't universal. That is true. They were specifically observed in those who weren't already getting much DHA and EPA through diet. For many people today who don't eat much fish or don't eat fish at all, supplementing with a direct source of omega-3s is a sensible idea. And just to note here, I don't think Dr. Fayet-Moore would disagree with this. In fact, she mentions a few moments later that she takes fish oil herself, presumably because of inconsistent or irregular fish consumption. Okay, back to the conversation. I recently swapped my late morning coffee for something new, Nandaka from Peak. And I have to say, friends, I've been genuinely impressed. With Nandaka, you still get that smooth lift in energy and focus, but without the crash or that wired feeling that often comes with coffee. And yeah, I was skeptical too, but this is not your average coffee alternative. It's truly been a real upgrade for me, helping me drop into a focused flow in afternoons when I'm reading, writing, or prepping for episodes here in my office. What sets Nandaka apart is the attention to detail. Cacao butter for better absorption and triple toxin screening for purity. It's made with 100% fruiting body mushrooms, ceremonial grade cacao, and fermented tea. No fillers and no grainy mycelium. We love a thoughtful formulation here at The Proof. Right now, Peak is offering 20% off for life plus a free starter kit. That's a rechargeable frother and glass beaker with your purchase. And there's a 90-day money-back guarantee, so you can try Nandaka risk-free. Just head to peaklifecom/Simon. That's PIQUE life.com/Simon.
Another example is all the studies looking at fish oil supplementation and the primary outcome that you'd want, which might be a myocardial infarction, preventing heart attacks. And you're not consistently seeing that effect, but you're seeing it with fish intake. And so on. So we often go, as soon as we start supplementing with one micronutrient, the outcome that we expect we're going to get doesn't happen because food is synergy. It's a complex system. It's not a simple system. And that's the complex system theory, right? That everything interacts and the outcome or the sum is not just adding the parts together. It's much more complex than that. So there's a place for fortification of calcium, of plant milks or whatever, but the effect is not going to be the same effect that you would see when that calcium's sitting in the dairy matrix or it's sitting in the whole food and it's being absorbed more efficiently. It's working with other micronutrients like potassium and so on.
Are you familiar with the Eat Lancet? I'm sure you've seen the
Yes.
Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet.
Yeah, I am.
I think if I recall correctly, within that they had room for about, was it 250 grams of dairy a day? Does that sound about right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and so if someone's consuming dairy, is that volume of dairy going to be sufficient to help them consume enough of these particular nutrients in dairy like calcium and vitamin D and iodine?
So one of the criticisms of the Eat Lancet was the lack of meeting micronutrient needs. So I know that in some population groups, I don't recall it because I haven't looked at it recently, but I believe like pregnancy and lactation, they were nowhere near nutrient targets with the Eat Lancet. And I think it's being revised right now for a second iteration of it, where it does focus more on micronutrient needs. So yes, but I don't think it's taken for all population groups to be able to meet their micronutrient needs eating in that way. But it shows that we can definitely include animal foods in a sustainable way. You got to include the ones that are rich in nutrients, right? And not have too much, because too much of anything throws off the balance of your nutrient intake. If you're eating loads of beans and your diet's predominantly beans and nothing else, it doesn't have variety. And without variety, you're not going to get the micronutrients that we need. So at the end of the day, having variety is important. The more variety and the more color variety, the healthier the diet generally is. And vitamin D, because you mentioned it, that's a big one, right? It's a shortfall nutrient. 1 in 2 people globally are deficient, and even more in some countries. It's a vitamin, although technically it's not, because we can make it, so it doesn't fit the definition of true, vitamin. But giving Australia as an example, also in the United States, in the dietary guidelines, it's the one nutrient that you cannot meet with diet, right? So every single fortification strategy or increasing fish consumption, or there's been lots of ways of modeling to be able to meet vitamin D intakes. Dietary guidelines cannot do it. So we published a paper, I think it was last year, where we modeled the main source of vitamin D that can meet your daily intake, which is UV exposed mushrooms. And then we were able to meet the vitamin D through the modeling in the diet. So that's, again, one of the reasons I love mushrooms is because they do, like, they have this natural ability, just like our skin, to produce vitamin D when exposed to sunlight. Humans aren't getting enough from sunlight. There's loads of reasons. As we age, we can't make vitamin D from UV as well. If you're indoors all day, it's really, if you have very fair skin, you avoid the sun because of cancer risk. If you have very dark skin, you have the natural protection for UV, so you actually can't make it. So it's only a small, U curve, the middle of the U curve of the population that can actually make vitamin D. But then a lot of them aren't, just not outside enough to make it. So it's a key nutrient. It's involved in more than 500 different reactions in the body. We have receptors everywhere, from immunity to cardiovascular disease to mental health. So it's a big problem because I think we can really reduce a lot of chronic disease burden by just meeting vitamin D targets.
Do you take any supplements?
I do, but I'm one of those, I'm not brand loyal or supplement loyal. It ebbs and flows, and I think it kind of ebbs and flows as my food preferences and my lifestyle and diet changes. So every once in a while, I might take a B complex vitamin. I also, on and off, take fish oil when my fish intake, because I do eat fish and I enjoy it, and I live near the ocean. So I'm very lucky to have amazing fish, access to fish. And that's basically probably my go-to nutrients. Vitamin D, I do put my mushrooms in the sun, and I eat maybe, as a family, we eat about 0.5 kilo a week. So my vitamin D status is actually always really high. I do micronutrient status checks once a year, and they're all spot on. So other than those, sometimes when I need the energy metabolism support, I'll take a B complex. But fish oil is probably my biggest one, omega-3 fatty acids that I know I'm probably not hitting my targets for.
Yeah. I eat a little differently to you. I eat plant-based. I think you know that. And I do take a multivitamin that has it has B12 and has iodine and a little bit of zinc and selenium. And then in addition to a multi, I take a DHA EPA.
Yeah.
You're not getting that as you know, unless you're eating fish. And my micronutrient status is great. We're all different, but that's how it's been for me for the last 10 years. Speaking of food and making food tasty, one thing that a lot of us add to our food in cooking is salt.
Yes.
And I know that you did a very interesting published a very interesting study a few years back that got a lot of media attention. Tell us about, firstly, why you were inspired to research salt and what were the main takeaways from that research?
I was inspired because I think it's just a curious mind, right? I'm always questioning my food environment and the foods around me. And I saw that everyone was buying and using pink salt. And I was at a conference where Professor Cress Eastman was speaking at. Cress is a authority on iodine worldwide. He's Australian. And he was talking about how he was somewhere where they were mining pink salt, and he said there was so much pollution, and he just said we did some sample testing of the salts, and we got really high levels of mercury and other things. And I went, you know what? Let's just self-fund a study, because it doesn't take very much to do this. We basically purchase every pink salt we can buy in Australia, send it to the lab, do the mineral analysis, and then write up a paper on what we found. And what we found is that, yes, the pink salts do have slightly more minerals, which includes some of those micronutrients that we need, like calcium. but they also came with contamination. So not only did they have the higher amounts of minerals, but they also had heavy metals and contaminants in the salt. And Kress always said, if you're having salt, if it doesn't taste like salt, if it's not sodium chloride, then there are impurities. And it's the impurities that you like and that you taste. So basically, we found that, yes, it has more nutrients, but in order for you to have any meaningful contribution of those nutrients to your diet, you would have to exceed the WHO recommendations for sodium. So 1 teaspoon, 5 grams is about 2,000 milligrams of sodium. For most people, you don't want anything higher than 2,300 milligrams. So you'd have to have 6 teaspoons of pink salt per day to get that extra bit of calcium or that extra bit of, nutrition. But at the same time, I'm always wary of anything that we do every day when it comes to food. Like, it's great if you eat a banana every day, but you don't want to have the same banana from the same farm, because there's environmental exposures. There's nothing to be worried about. But that's why variety is also important, because salt is the one thing that we add every day to food if you're cooking. And especially in young children, even though a lot of the contaminants were under safe levels, there was one sample where there was toxic levels of lead. But most of the samples were, within safe limits. But you think mercury accumulates. And if you're adding salt to your family's cooking every day and you have children, then they're growing up with that mercury accumulating in the body, even though the level in the food is actually safe. So we did actually look at the science since. So that was back in 2020. And there's been a couple papers. So one paper used, I think it was published in 2019. They gave people pink salt and regular salt and saw if there was any effect on blood pressure. And it was no different. So even though the nutrients were, higher in the pink, it made no meaningful contribution to blood pressure. Now, blood pressure or heart disease is the number 1 killer worldwide in most developed nations. And of course, having high blood pressure is a major risk factor. So my recommendation is, if you do want to have salt, limit the amount you add, but choose iodized, because iodine is another nutrient we don't get enough of. But you can also look at potassium-enriched salt as well, that you can add. And of course, blending mushrooms into your dish, they have a natural umami taste and natural glutamates, kind of like MSG, that sensitizes your taste buds to salt. So you can lower the amount of salt you add to your dish, but without changing the acceptability of the salt. And then another study came out in Italy where they compared Hawaiian pink salt and Himalayan pink salt. And again, the level of mercury was extremely high. Lead was extremely high in those 2 samples. So this is recent research showing, again, toxic levels of lead in both the Hawaiian pink and the Himalayan pink. So really, it's make an informed choice. If you're having pink salt, to know that there's some risk, and that it's not this health halo, that's going to make you miraculously healthy by having pink instead of your table salt that's sodium chloride.
Yeah, I think some of that is marketing, but it's also, it's a little confusing because the message is the whole food, less processed, less kind of synthetic version of foods are better. And then in this case, you have this more naturally derived salt from the Himalayas or wherever it is, and yet it contains more environmental contaminants than regular table salt, which is it synthetic? How do they manufacture regular table salt?
That's a good question. I think there's different ways of manufacturing it. I don't know the regular table salt that we get, how it's
where
made.
From.
Yeah, maybe. I think a lot of it might be derived from the sea and then purified. But I actually don't know. It's a good question.
Okay. But nonetheless, we can save our money on the expensive pink salt, which is good news for budget and means more money for other foods. And you mentioned there the potassium chloride salt, and that it reminds me, there was a study out of China a few years ago. You probably remember this. I believe it was a randomized controlled trial that randomized people to regular salt or the potassium chloride salt. And can't remember how many years it was over, but I believe the primary outcome was stroke, or perhaps it was combined cardiovascular events. But the subjects that were randomized to the potassium chloride had significantly lower risk of having a stroke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It works against sodium, right? So it's a really clear way to get your electrolyte balance and lower blood pressure. But you can also eat fruits and veggies and get that potassium. So it all comes down, right, to, that's why a plant-rich diet is so good for you, because you're getting, it's just the recommendation's not sexy, but like the mechanisms are. There's so many, and they're really, really cool. And Simon, you mentioned about, whole foods and natural. I think it's not so much natural, right? Because cyanide's natural. So I think we need to really, and cyanide kills instantly. It's natural, it resonates, but there's a caveat to that, right? Because most things are natural in our planet that are toxic or otherwise. So if someone wants to reduce their sodium intake, I really say anything that has a packaging, right? Because you open that package, and by law, it has to have how much sodium's in it. And your budget's 2,300. So just have a look. Those noodles are like 1,500. So you're spending most of your budget in that one food. Or, you want to have your regular canned beans, not your low sodium. That's fine, but see how much sodium's in it. But make a budget on anything that you're opening will have sodium. And that's going to be a greater contribution to your sodium intake than what you're adding at the table. What you add at the table, we have luckily taste buds and for salt. And when you add a lot, you can taste it, right? Whereas when it's in food, you don't necessarily taste that saltiness straight away. So that's kind of the hidden salt that you don't realize you're getting, that are probably going to make a bigger contribution to your diet than what you're adding, if making a whole food meal at home.
Was that research on pink salt, was that the study that of yours that's received the most media attention over the years, or is there another study that stands out?
The most to date, I think we got 1.6 billion reach, was the Mission Mushroom. And again, I think it's because we're in the space generation era, and food is the one thing that makes space relatable, right? So I think just the fact that it was space and it was food and it's mushrooms, and mushrooms are so cool. But but I'd say pink salt would be second. We had if you Googled pink salt at the time, we had like 14 pages on Google about our study. So it was a lot of media. I remember doing like 14 hours of interviews the day it got published. Yeah,
mushrooms certainly seem to be having a moment. Currently, why? And you've spoken to a few of these reasons, but if we zoom out, mushrooms as a kind of food group, why do you think they deserve a bigger place in our diets?
Oh, so many reasons. So mushrooms deserve a much bigger place in our diets. First and foremost, because it's nutrient density, right? So mushrooms have potassium and folate, which is like they're characterizing nutrients in our guidelines for vegetables. But then they also have that ability to make vitamin D in 100% of every single person's requirement across ages in one serve, which is unheard of. So that's typically found only in animals. Then you've got a quarter of daily intake of selenium and copper, which, you mentioned you're taking a multivitamin with selenium. So it has not only what you'd expect vegetables to have, but it also has components that you find in grains, in nuts, in animal foods. So it's across the food groups. And when you look at how mushrooms are currently classified in our dietary guidelines in Australia, they're kind of the other group under other vegetables. So they're with like lettuce and tomato. So in the fact that they have such high nutrient density across foods, it warrants them to have more attention. So I really think they need to sit out as its own group within vegetables, at the very least, if not its own food group. And that they're so versatile. I mean, you can grate them, you can eat them raw, you can eat them cooked, you can blend them, to make spaghetti bolognese or burgers or tacos. You can have them added to a dal. You can turned into a sauce, and they're extremely low in calories, and they meet every single dietary need, from vegan to animal-based to gluten-free to and that added culinary benefit as well of lowering salt needed in the dish, which is very important. So not only does it make it tasty with the umami, our fifth basic taste, but those natural glutamates means you need to add less salt. The other interesting bit about mushrooms, because we're not in the bioactive era yet, but one day we'll get there, is ergothioneine. So there's no frank deficiency for ergothioneine. It's a sulfur-containing amino acid that has potent antioxidant and immune-modulating properties. We have receptors for ergothioneine, specific receptors in our body for them. So it means we need them. It's tightly regulated. Our body does not like to get rid of it. And in a lot of disease states, like type 2 diabetes and I think heart disease, ergothioneine levels are low. When you look at food sources of ergothioneine, you've got mushrooms, and then it blows everything else out of the water. And it's really low in other foods, but black beans have some as well and some other foods. So it's really the highest source of ergothioneine in our diet. Plus the beta-glucans. A lot of medicinal mushrooms are very high in beta-glucans as well, because beta-glucans are, again, able to immunomodulate. Specifically in mushrooms that you eat, the edible mushroom varieties, it binds to bile acids and helps excrete bile acids. And then we need to make more, which we use cholesterol to make more. So it's very potent at lowering cholesterol, just like oats.
That's a great tip for anyone who has high LDL cholesterol or ApoB, another kind of practical strategy. What about ergosterol?
Yeah, so ergosterol, again, it's just like 7-hydroxycholesterol in our skin. It's a precursor to vitamin D. So that's when you put it in the sun. Your common mushroom that you get in the supermarket, your portobello, white button, Swiss brown, they're actually all the same species. So your Swiss brown and your portobello are the same mushroom, but portobello was harvested 2 days later. So that's the other bit from a sustainability perspective. Mushrooms are very quick to grow. And they help close the loop in circular agriculture as well, because the spent substrate can be used and treated for growing more plants. So there's also that argument of why they need to get more limelight in our diets. But ergosterol, again, it's predominantly a precursor to vitamin D. And of course, sterols, I'm sure it also has some sort of pathway as well in cholesterol lowering. It makes sense that it would, just like all plant sterols.
Right. It's competes for absorption and probably reduces the absorption of dietary cholesterol, I imagine.
Exactly. There's a few studies. They're not high. We need more research on mushrooms as a cholesterol-lowering food, like clinical evidence. But there are quite a few studies showing that it does lower cholesterol in humans when they eat edible mushrooms.
What's the protocol for increasing the vitamin D content of mushrooms? You mentioned sun a few times. What does that look like? I know that you're doing that at home. Is that a 24-hour thing? Does it need direct sun? Can it be indirect?
So it needs direct sun because your window sills would block the UVB, which is the UV that you want that makes the vitamin D, just like our skin. So if you're sitting inside and getting sunlight, you're not making vitamin D. So the mushrooms are the same. You want to put them into direct sun. It's about 15 minutes, depending which latitude you live in. So the best way to check is that there is actually UV when you check the weather. If there's UV, they'd be making vitamin D. So in summer, it's in most places in the world would have about 15 minutes exposed to vitamin D will make more than 1,000 IUs, which is the equivalent of a vitamin D supplement. If it's kind of middle of winter and you're higher latitude, then you probably want to leave it a bit longer, maybe an hour. But you can actually see the mushrooms tanning. So they do go a little bit brown, and you can just pop them right back in the fridge. The vitamin D lasts for 8 days. So it's basically the shelf life of your mushrooms at home. What I do is I come home, if it's during the day that I do groceries, then I put them out and I pack all the groceries away and then grab them. So it's a barrier. You do have to put it out and remember to put it out, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. But there are also, I know in the US and in California specifically, there are growers that actually UV expose the mushrooms when they're harvested. So in Australia and also in the US, there are options that you can buy vitamin D mushrooms already. So
Is that something that's written on the label, or are you just looking for brown mushrooms? If you see brown mushrooms in the grocery store, does that mean they've already done some sun baking?
No, so you don't. They would still be nice and white with the UV pulses in the growers do. It's just they pulse, like they zap 3 times with the UV high dose, and it makes the vitamin D. It's only if you leave it home for a while, it will go brown. They're literally tanning. Usually it would have to say on the label, right? Vitamin D mushrooms or something along, making a claim that it's got vitamin D.
And what about the brown Swiss mushrooms that you might see at the supermarket that are already brown? Have they already been exposed to the sun, or are they just they're just naturally brown and you'd still need to put them in the sun?
They're naturally brown. So they generally have more ergosterol in them. So the bigger, more mature mushrooms have more. If you want to produce even more, you increase the surface area exposed to sun. So you want to put the gills facing up because there's more surface area, they produce more. Or if you're cooking that day, you can slice them and put it sliced in the sun, and the sliced will produce even more vitamin D, like 65% more. So and remember, it's 15 minutes for most people, about 3 to 5 button mushrooms, so it's not a lot, will give you 1,000 IUs. Now, if you're making a mushroom-based meal or adding mushrooms to a meal, you probably use more than that. And vitamin D is fat soluble, so you don't have to have it every day. You can have 2 or 3 mushroom meals a week, and that's probably enough to keep your vitamin D status up.
Are all of these mushrooms that you would see in the grocery store, there's different varieties, you said earlier they're really the same species. So am I right in assuming that the typical content of vitamin D, of beta-glucans, of ergothioneine, all of these different bioactive compounds and selenium you mentioned earlier, is relatively similar, or are there some kind of mushroom all-stars?
Yes, no, it's all very similar. So there might be like oyster mushroom, for example, which is a different variety, because it has more of a stem, right? It has so you've got more beta-glucan in the stem and more ergosterol on the cap. So I see a lot of people chopping the stem. I'm like, no, they're beta-glucans. Don't waste them, and it's fully edible, right? So there's little nuances like that. But generally speaking, they all have kind of the key characterizing nutrients and bioactives in mushrooms.
And what about eating them raw, like in a salad, versus cooking them? Does that affect any of the nutrient bioavailability and absorption?
Yeah, so cooking, always you lose some nutrients. You lose a little bit of vitamin D when cooking any food that contains vitamin D, right? So people get too bogged down on that nitty gritty. And I think it's just as long as you're eating it and you're getting a variety of nutrients from the different food sources, eat what you like. Like if you like grating your mushroom on a salad, go for it, right? But it will have a bit more vitamins, I guess, that are degraded through heat and cooking than you would like folate as well, for example. Your minerals don't really get affected by cooking, right? They can be created or destroyed generally. So you don't lose many minerals through the cooking process. But have it the way you enjoy and have it a variety. Don't only have it one way.
Are there any downsides or risks to consuming mushrooms daily?
No, not that I can think of. I guess if there's any food poisoning risk that you'd get with any other fresh produce, right? But in terms of the actual compounds in mushrooms and the nutrients, no. And that's the beauty of food, right? When you are getting your nutrients from food, it's very unlikely that you can exceed any nutrient targets. Now, that's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of multivitamins, personally, because I find a lot of the multivitamins have your daily recommended intake for them. And folate is a big one. So folate seems harmless, it's water soluble, but and this is back in my research, in my PhD as well, I researched folate, and it seems to be that the more folate you have, right, it's really important for DNA replication, for energy metabolism, But if you have any abnormalities, any polyp or any precancerous tumors, that folate will feed the tumor. So if you have a very high dose of folate, it can exacerbate, right, the replication, and it can make the cells replicate more quickly. So there's clear evidence that too much folate for any pre-existing tumors can make it worse. But you also want to make sure you're getting enough. So, and folate is really hard to get from diet. 400 micrograms a day from plant foods is actually really hard. So there's a place for folate supplementation, but just be careful. Look at the dose. A lot of supplements nowadays exceed the daily intake, and more is not better. More can actually be quite detrimental to health. We've seen here in Australia with B3, people are getting neurotoxicity from vitamin B3 because they had it in their magnesium salts, they had it in their multivitamin, they had it in their energy drink, and then all of a sudden, a vitamin that we've never had issues of getting enough, and we've got people having neurological symptoms. So I think just always be careful. Read your supplement, see what percentage of daily intake it's offering. Anyone that's 100%, that's assuming you're not getting anything from the diet. And I'd caution there, because anything that's 100% can lead to overconsuming that. And every time you overconsume one micronutrient, it affects the balance.
Whether you're training hard or simply aiming to feel your best every day, IM8 Daily Ultimate Essentials has you covered. It's the daily multi-nutrient that I've recently switched to and now recommend. With 92 bioavailable nutrients, including vitamin B12, vitamin D, iodine, choline, K2, CoQ10 for heart health, and MSM for joint recovery. It is NSF certified for sport. It ships to over 30 countries, including the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and works with both plant-based and omnivorous diets. I've used several multi-nutrients over the years, but IM8's clean formulation and commitment to science and clinical validation really stood out. So much so that I've joined their scientific advisory board alongside Dr. David Katz and Dr. Suzanne Devkota, two previous guests of The Proof. For listeners of The Proof, IM8 is offering 10% off your first Daily Ultimate Essentials order with the code SIMON at checkout. Just head to im8health.com. That's IM8, HEALTH.com, and use promo code SIMON to get started. Yeah, I think that's good advice to look at the label of any supplement that you're taking. And also, to your point, like it gets very easy to start stacking supplements, and then all of a sudden you're getting the same nutrient from 3 different sources. One's a multivitamin, one's some type of kind of nutrient fortified protein shake that you're having. And, across the day, you could be having 300, 400, 500% of a particular nutrient. So I think it's a good reminder for everyone to do an audit, and that more is not always better. In the case of folate, or any of these nutrients, how good is the body at kind of upregulating and downregulating absorption based on status? So if you're someone who is consuming, let's say, a lot of folate, does the body downregulate absorption to kind of factor that in?
Yes, it does. It's pretty smart for most of them. Vitamin C is a really good example of one. I actually saw recently on LinkedIn a doctor post about, I have 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C every day. And I'm like, well, you could just have 200 and the absorption will be the same. If you have very little vitamin C in your diet, the body absorbs like 95% of it. If you have a lot of vitamin C, it becomes efficient and it goes, well, I only need to absorb 20% of this vitamin C. So there definitely is that up and down regulation. There's also genetics. So that's the nutrient gene interactions that we know. So there are quite a few genes that affect our metabolism, from vitamin C to vitamin D, iron, zinc, calcium, choline. Like there's actually quite a few. And if you, I know, for example, for me, for iron, and hence why I do have red meat, not a lot, but I do include it in my diet, because I've got 3 different genes that affect my absorption of iron. How, like the receptor binding, the absorption, and iron is actually quite toxic. So it exists in two states, 2+ and 3+. And that's a perfect example of more is not better, right? Because if you start just supplementing with iron and you're not getting it through diet, then it can lead to damaging the gut microbiome because it kills the good bugs in our gut because it's oxidative. When you have too much and you don't have enough cars to carry it or to hold it down and stop it from going crazy, it overflows and it does a lot of damage, right? So there's that inter-individual variation in how we metabolize and break down lots of different nutrients in a diet, and knowing that allows you to tailor your diet for your genetics as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I'm often asked for very specific recommendations for, like the question I asked you at the beginning. I was interested to see how you would answer it. What should people eat? And I think over the years, I've become broader and broader in the way that I answer that, in that there is a theme, I believe, that we see where, high fiber, low saturated fat, an abundance of colorful plants, a diet that's providing enough micronutrients, we see good long-term health outcomes. And you can kind of cut that up in a number of ways. It could be low carb, it could be high carb, it could be Mediterranean. Like there's so many different ways to do that. But I totally agree with you that because of genes and bioindividuality, at an individual level, you take those public health recommendations and then you apply them to your own life and you test and look at nutrient status, and then you can make very educated changes that are specific to you.
100%. When we talk about nutrition recommendations, it's population recommendations. We're sharing information, but we're not giving advice, right? It's not one-on-one. It's not for you, Simon, based on your genetics, this is what your body needs. And as you've said, if you're in tune with your body and you have the knowledge and the skills, which not many people do, to trial and error yourself and figure out what works for you, then that's great. But there's also the genetics that you can do with a health professional to give you that recommendation. And I know, like my genes, I would fail to thrive on a vegan diet. It would be so hard for me because I've got like the B12, I've got the iron, I've got the vitamin D. Like it's really would be very difficult for me. So ethical reasons aside.
I think when people hear that, sometimes they use that to as a way of arguing that, humans, there is kind of no consensus, and that one person might thrive on all meat and one person might thrive on all plants, and it's completely variable. But
it's not completely variable.
I don't know that it's completely variable. I think there is a big picture, a theme that seems to be pretty consistent. And then from there's certainly individualization and personalization, but I'm not sure it's as extreme as saying that, someone's going to thrive on eating only bacon and the next person's going to thrive eating only pineapple.
No, not at all, because there's so many things, right? So a good example is the angiotensin converting enzyme SNP, and that's to do with blood pressure and salt sensitivity. So people who have a particular variant in their gene are very sensitive to sodium in the diet. Their blood pressure goes up. Now, 7 out of 10 people globally have that gene. So no wonder if we have public health recommendations to lower sodium, to lower blood pressure, it works. But at an individual level, if you don't have that, like you do not need to cut your sodium intake. It can actually be detrimental to your heart disease risk having low sodium. And that's the nuance, right? So for population studies, if the recommendations fit, but we know at the individual level, there's genetic variations in how we break down, how we absorb and assimilate nutrients that can impact our health.
Do you think we will soon reach a point where genetic profiling is done and that will provide very specific recommendations to someone about the foods that they should eat more of or less of, or the supplements they might want to consider supplementing with, or the form of the supplement?
100%. We already do it. Every single baby born in the world, basically in the world, does a nutrigenetic test at birth. So it's for PKU, phenylketonuria. Basically, people that have that gene can't break down phenylalanine, which is an amino acid. it builds up in the body and it does damage. So all they have to do is avoid products that contain phenylalanine. And we even have regulatory frameworks for nutrigenetic variations. So often when you see something that has aspartame, it says warning, contains phenylalanine. It's for the people with PKU. So that gene that already exists. So every single baby born basically in the world has that genetic test. I 100% believe that moving forward, as it becomes cheaper and cheaper to do all the other nutrigenetic variants, that people are going to be born knowing. So if I know that my child is salt sensitive, I'm not going to add salt to the baby food I'm making for him or her, right? You know, if you need more omega-3s, you're either going to supplement or you're going to eat more fish if you eat fish. And there's research from the University of Toronto, Professor Ahmed El-Sohami. He's a pioneer in the field of nutrigenomics. I was in his class in undergrad in 1999, so hence why I absolutely love this. They've done studies showing that when people are given genetic-based advice, they understand it more and they're more likely to change behavior.
Yeah, that makes me think about, I'm not sure how I feel about these microbiome tests yet. I've had mixed feelings because, at least from the people I've spoken to and some of the research I've looked at, I'm not sure how predictive they are yet as to what specifically someone should eat. But one thing that I'll say, like, put that to the side, where I think these apps and kind of health companies are making a difference is that when people think they're getting a personalized recommendation to eat more fruits and vegetables and fiber, and it's been tailored to them, even if it hasn't and the science isn't there, and that's a whole nother ethical question and a question for science in general, if that piece is not there, the adherence is likely to be very, very high just from thinking that, wow, I've done this state-of-the-art microbiome test, I've sent my poop in, and it's been examined by scientists, and they've told me that I should eat more eggplant and more strawberries and more carrots and more sweet potatoes.
Because it's personal, right? So when I was dating my husband, he used to be a shark diver at the time. And we'd have dinner parties and he'd be talking about diving with sharks and this and that. And then as soon as people found out that I was in nutrition, the conversation shifted to me. It was hilarious because then they were asking questions and wanting that personalized advice and information. But it just shows, right? As soon as it becomes personal, because it's about them. Like, it's really cool you're diving with sharks, but, this is about me. And then if they're getting information about them, then you're more likely to adhere to it and understand it as well. Because you pay attention, because it's about you. And at the end of the day, we all care about ourselves, first and foremost, right? So it's so good to make it relevant. On the microbiome stuff, I agree with you. The science is not really there to make actionable recommendations. It's not. There are associations, but to actually tell someone exactly what to eat, and plus the gut microbiome shifts within days, right? But we revert to our genetics, right? So that's where the genetic advice is so good, because it's your blueprint. It's what the body reverts to. So eating according to your genetics is quite useful because it's an actionable recommendation that you can do. Whereas the microbiome science, it's still emerging. It's not there to the point where we go, okay, Simon, this is your gut microbiome profile. With confidence, I can tell you that you've got to eat this.
That personalization piece is kind of missing there. But if someone wanted today to eat for their genetic profile, how do they do that?
Well, there's lots of different companies in the world that offer it. The one that I use is called Nutrigenomics with an X. And Nutrigenomics was founded by my professor in Canada. So I know that it's evidence-based. So whatever company you're looking for, you got to check where's the lab, who's doing it, who's the scientific committee behind it. Because there's knowing the science, but just like our issue with nutrition is a translation of the science. So if that translation isn't done well, then you're getting misinformation, right? So I think there's lots of different companies that you can do your genetic testing. Just make sure that they're credible as you do with any science, and who's behind it and who's translating that science. Ask them, can I see the papers that you're making your recommendations on, or who's on your scientific committee? You can ask questions and find out, is the lab high quality? Do you have confidence in the results that you're getting?
At the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned that your PhD was looking at nutrient status, intake and status in a group of women in Australia, and that more recently you'd also looked at nutrient intake and status, I believe, in Australians and New Zealanders. And you alluded to the fact that there was some overlap with regards to nutrients that are commonly underconsumed or potentially kind of subclinical deficiencies. What are those nutrients? And if you were in charge of the next iteration of the Australian Dietary Guidelines, what changes would you make from sort of broad food recommendations that would best address these micronutrients that are being underconsumed?
My God, that's like a dream question. Okay, so the priority nutrients, what we did, so to give context, we looked at all population data that existed in Australia and New Zealand. We've actually just published the US as well. So that's hot off the press 2 days ago. A similar situation. So lots of micronutrient shortfalls in the population, but the priority nutrients was slightly different. Basically what we did is what are the shortfalls? What are those nutrients associated with when it comes to health effects? So where is the biggest opportunity to decrease malnutrition and to decrease the burden of diet-related chronic disease through nutrition, right? And then we applied this matrix to categorize for each life stage, from toddlers all the way to pregnancy to the elderly, because each life stage has different requirements for nutrients and each sex has different requirements. So we went for the different population groups, from toddlers to teenagers to males, female, adults, pregnancy, elderly. What are the nutrients we need to prioritize to get the biggest bang for our buck with anything that we do in terms of food, food as medicine, I guess. And we found that it was calcium, number one, vitamin D, magnesium, folate, omega-3, and fiber, dietary fiber. So those are the top 6 across all the food groups. Iron, selenium, and zinc were also priority, but they weren't across all the food groups. There were more than 20 micronutrient shortfalls. So these are just the top 6 that we went based on the science. What should we start? Because there's so many. Where do we start? Because we can't fix them all, right? So we went, there's so many. These are the ones that are going to address malnutrition the most, the gap, and also address chronic disease. They're associated with chronic disease reduction, from cancer to type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. What foods should we then be eating? So we didn't publish in terms of what foods, but I get often asked what foods these would be. What are some examples of food groups or foods? And I guess that relates back to your dietary guideline question. It's really dairy was up there. It provides calcium, zinc, and magnesium. So 3 priority nutrients. Oily fish. So they're not all animal, I promise. So oily fish, again, because of that selenium, zinc, omega-3, and vitamin D. Then you've got your legumes. Legumes are underrated. I mean, I grew up in Brazil eating rice and beans every day. We basically have it in every meal because they're nutritional powerhouses. They are so rich in dietary fiber, but also so many micronutrients like zinc and magnesium, folate, iron, right? Although it's less bioavailable iron, but it's still a very rich source. Your leafy greens, my favorite spinach, but all leafy greens again for that folate that's really hard to get, and magnesium. Whole grains for dietary fiber, but also the magnesium and also the iron. A lot of whole grains, especially fortified breakfast cereals, are one of the top sources of iron in the Australian diet, along with fortified bread. So you mentioned fortification before. There is a place for quite a few of these micronutrients coming from fortification because people just aren't eating these foods enough. Nuts and seeds, again, nutritional powerhouses, and mushrooms, right? Or fungi foods, really. You've got yeast as well, nutritional yeast in there that can provide some of that selenium and some of the vitamin D if UV exposed. So those foods, really, I mean, they're already part of the dietary guidelines, but I would put more emphasis on legumes and ensuring legumes are accessible, and probably need to do education around it, because in a lot of Western diets, it's just culturally not eaten, right? It's only a small proportion of people that actually have it, or if you follow a dietary pattern like plant-based. Now, with the dairy, again, it's so important to get all those nutrients from dairy. I wouldn't pull it out into something separate, but if you are putting it into like having equivalents like the soy or the oat milks and alternatives, I'm not sure how I would place them, if I would group it all together. I feel like there's probably another group that fits it, because the nutrition is different, right, of the alternatives to the dairy nutrition.
I'm of the view that there needs to be policy around plant-based alternatives. So if a plant-based alternative milk is going to be on the shelf, and this is probably a little bit controversial, and I'm sure some people would debate this, but I think there should be a minimum criteria for nutrients like calcium, iodine, vitamin D, and probably for protein.
Yeah.
In those
100%.
alternatives.
I think part of the problem, and I see it a lot, I go to a cafe, pregnant young woman, oat latte please, it's organic, unfortified. She's missing out on iodine, which is like the number one most preventable cause of neurological disease, really, in adulthood, is not enough iodine in pregnancy. So she's not getting the iodine, not getting the calcium. Yeah, it's just crazy. And in the US, I believe quite a lot of milk is fortified with vitamin D, low levels, but you're getting that vitamin D fortification. So I 100%, I feel like it's gone to the point where there's a place for plant-based milks 100% in the diet. If you're going from a protein perspective, soy is the most equivalent. But in terms of micronutrient, there isn't an equivalent. So we need to educate people or create that policy, or both.
The average person out there who's ordering their milk at a coffee shop isn't examining the nutritional profile of that alternative, and that's where I think policy can come in. And I know you were kind of just joking about as you were reeling those off being all animal foods, but
just I actually had two. The rest are all not.
I had written a list before you, as you were talking about the nutrients. I had written a list: dairy, fish, and dark leafy greens being the top three that I thought you would mention. But overall, that entire list kind of steers you more towards a Mediterranean, Nordic, DASH diet, all of those types of dietary patterns. And the point I wanted to make was that even though I eat plant-based, I pride myself on being able to wear a purely nutrition hat. And when I'm doing that, I'm not looking at foods through the lens of sustainability or other reasons. It's what foods are going to promote the best human health outcomes. And I totally agree with you that can include animal foods, and for sure the ones that you mentioned there, dairy, particularly fermented dairy, which, over the years, I think more and more evidence has come out supporting the consumption of fermented dairy foods.
Yes, 100%, but so is milk. Like, just milk is actually very nutritious. And when you look at all the science, there was a systematic review published a few years ago. It's predominantly, like, I think there was one, maybe prostate cancer risk was slightly higher, and maybe acne in I can't remember exactly the negative. It was like a couple, whereas everything else from weight, glucose, like every single outcome was actually really positive. So even though it's trendy, fermented foods, and they're great, but there's a place for fermented foods, but also just dairy milk, and it's cheap and it's accessible and people can afford it. And we have to also take that into account in this current climate. Affordability of nutrition is really important as well. And you've got to have foods, and hence all those things I mentioned are very affordable, right? These are all foods that are accessible and affordable to the population. Because if we are going to nudge people to eat better, we can't just sit in a place of privilege and give recommendations to those that aren't sitting in that place of privilege.
Right, and then we get to zoom out, after looking through the human health lens and thinking about, like, how do we actually make this possible while looking after the planet, which is a whole nother It's a whole nother discussion. And so we won't tackle that in this episode.
Regenerative farming.
Yeah, but then that's a loaded
Yes, it's a loaded topic.
That's a loaded term, and there's a ton of claims in the regenerative ag. I've done 4 or 5 episodes and hours reading that research, and
there's a lack of nutrition though.
There's a ton of misinformation in the regen ag. It's not governed, and it is really the wild west at this stage, particularly in this country in America, where there's a regenerative agriculture limelight right now, but what it means and what's been validated by science that's been replicated, it's totally understudied. And right now there's a lot of, it looks good and it sounds good, but like lacking actual scientific validation with regards to comparing it to these other models. So how does it compare to standard grazing? How does it compare to factory farming? How does it compare to growing other food on that land? And so I think we have so much more to explore there, and the kind of the horse has been, or the cart's been put ahead of the horse in on that topic in a number of ways.
At the end of the day, from a sustainability, just to touch on it briefly, because I do quite a lot of keynotes around the world in the future of food and what we'll be eating in 100 years. And for me, it's really, and even talking to farmers and meeting them at farmers conferences, the key thing, it's not from farm to fork. People say that a lot, but it's not. It's from farm to human health. And what I would love to see in the future of food, and whatever sustainability methodology a farmer would use or the food system would use, it needs to connect to the humans consuming the food and to the end product of food consumption, all the way to the end, right? So imagine, for example, iodine is a big deal here in Australia. We're quite deficient in the soils, and to the point that there's mandatory fortification of bread with iodine. And you can also get iodized salt. And it's a micronutrient that you don't need a lot of. Of course, it's micro, but it's very, very important for health and for cognitive development in childhood and as we age. So imagine if we could just get farmers to have more soil with iodine by their farming practices, and potentially have crops that they choose crops and their practices based on the nutritional density of those crops. Then we wouldn't be having to fortify the food supply at the end.
You might not have to fortify that oat milk.
Exactly, right? So that's the idea. I think from a sustainability and nutrition perspective, we need nutrition scientists and dietitians and anyone in public health talking to farmers and vice versa. Rather than working in silos across the food system, we need that greater connection so that we can solve a lot of the problems with the people that are actually growing our food.
Farmers, nutrition scientists, geoscientists, climate scientists, all in the same room.
Yeah.
Very much needed. Totally agree with you on that. Let's finish off with eating the rainbow, because you kind of touched on it, and I know that you've written a paper about this recently. What are these bioactive compounds in plant foods, particularly the colorful plant foods that we haven't yet spoken about?
So we've, of course, talked a lot about the micronutrient era that hopefully we'll get in at some point. So this is really moving forward to the bioactive compounds in fruits and vegetables. They're the compounds that give it color. They're the compounds which we term bioactives, because my pet peeve is when people call them antioxidant. I'm like, antioxidant is a verb. Bioactive is a noun. So a verb in the sense that bioactive compounds have antioxidant properties. They have anti-inflammatory, anti-carcinogenic, anti-diabetic, and anti-fill in the blank. They do it, right? Immunoregulating. So these compounds are quite powerful. There was a paper published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2003 that showed that in apples, only 0.4% of their antioxidant capacity comes from vitamin C. So the 99%, that 0.6, actually comes from the bioactive compounds, the flavonoids and the polyphenols that are in plants. So we did a project where we said, look, everyone keeps saying eat the rainbow, but no one's actually proven it. So what we did is we summarized all the science that existed on color-associated compounds from fruits and vegetables and their health effects. So again, it was that review of reviews, so really high-level evidence showing what they do. And we actually published a really cool infographic that talks about all the different ones that are in it. So we had beta-carotene, alpha-carotene, lutein, zeaxanthin, flavonols, flavones. So a lot of people here in Australia call me Flav. So I've embraced Flav because they're the flavonoids and the Flav compounds. Lycopene, anthocyanin, and other carotenoids. So there are different colors from red, orange, yellow, white, green. So green's chlorophyll. And those compounds had 6 of the 8 compounds that we looked at had unique health benefits. So it shows that you don't want to just be eating the banana every day and getting the yellow, but you want the green, you want the purple, you want the pink, because each color compound has a unique health benefit, which might be from lowering risk of cancer or lowering risk from death from any cause to improving risk of hip fracture, just to name a few. So, and basically what we found is that the benefits associated with eating a variety of color go above and beyond the benefits of just eating lots of fruits and vegetables. The more color variety, the better the health outcomes. And there's other research linked to this that shows that color is a visual cue for eating. We eat with our eyes first, right? So if something looks beautiful and it's colorful, it makes you want to eat it. So by adding just a color to your plate or to your life will help you not only eat better, get those benefits of that color, but it goes above and beyond the fact that you're eating a fruit or a vegetable.
Are there any things that we can do to enhance the absorption of these compounds other than, for example, having, let's say a source of fat like olive oil or avocado with dark leafy greens to help the carotenoids absorb? Is there anything else that we can do?
Yes, so choosing foods that are processed. How to go against the grain. So processing increases the accessibility and the absorption of those nutrients. I know a lot of people know lycopene. Lycopene is in tomatoes. And there's been a lot of science showing that having it processed and treated and heated and made into a sauce for your pasta is going to have much higher levels of lycopene than if you were to just eat a tomato raw, right? So if you're looking for the most bioactives in the diet, don't disregard foods that have been processed and made tasty and made accessible to get that color. So of course, it's not all foods that have it, but actually cooking and processing will increase. And one example is juice. So juice has way greater levels, generally, of bioactives than if you were to eat an orange. So that's one example how variety is important. And then having that color variety. Another really cool way, like green, right? Your dark leafy veggies are super good for you. But you can get green from fruit too. And a really cool way to have green is to eat the green rind of watermelon. It actually, you can stir fry with it. You can pickle it. It's a really nice way to get that bring. They're edible. Most people throw it out. So from a food waste and sustainability perspective, it's a nice hack to actually eat and cook your watermelon rind when you're having it.
I know there's going to be people in the comments saying, oh, but I've heard that you shouldn't eat the skin on hard fruits because that's where all the pesticides end up.
So pesticides are mostly water soluble, right? That's the beauty of them. So a lot of pesticides you can rinse and wash and you're not going to get any. And it's one of those fear-mongering things where you're like, don't worry about the pesticides. If there's any, it's within safe levels. And the benefits that you're going to get from the bioactives, from the micronutrients, like they have real health outcomes on your life. There's actually another really interesting study. I don't know if you've heard the jelly bean study, where there's a bowl of jelly beans. So in this research, this laboratory research, participants were given a bowl of their favorite jelly bean color. So for me, it might be orange. So I get given a bowl orange and they measure how much the people were eating, their favorite jelly beans. And then they gave them a bowl of mixed colored jelly beans. And people who ate the mixed colored jelly beans still ate more than their favorite color. So that's where eating color variety, so the more variety you get in your diet, the more you tend to eat. So you can use that to our advantage with fruits and vegetables by having more colors, because you're more likely to eat more if you're just having one too. So start with one, but then add a couple, because you'll just eat more fruits and veg.
I think that might be scaring people who are thinking about their body weight though.
Well, that's the buffet effect, right? So if the more variety you have in your diet, generally the more you eat. And that's why people eat so much at buffets. Because the body is really, it's designed to get those micronutrients. So the more variety, it's like, yay, I actually have access to all these different foods.
I just want to clarify something. You're not saying that being obese or overweight is healthy.
No, not necessarily. But I'm also not saying that it's unhealthy. Everyone's different, right? You can be in a larger body and have perfect micronutrient and metabolic markers, but you can also be in a thin body and be extremely malnourished. So it's not my pet peeve, I think, when I'm talking about society and body size, is that we put all the focus on that, and hence why it's all about calories and sugars and macros, because we're not prioritizing the micronutrients. And I think that a lot of people, because they're micronutrient deficient, their body's not functioning to the way it should be in the first place. So you're not going to shift the weight. You're not going to get your metabolic markers under control if you don't have little helpers that are like keeping the wheels turning.
I agree with that there's been too much focus on macros. It doesn't have to be an either or. Because we have a tendency to go from one extreme to the other. Like, okay, let's throw out calories and macronutrients and go just to micros, but then we end up with the same issue in the other direction. So
it all counts. Like, we need everything. We need the macros, the micros, the bioactives, and we need the systems thinking rather than singular siloed thinking.
Given your interest in bioactive compounds, do you have a preference? And you might say this is majoring in the minors and this level of detail doesn't matter, but do you have a preference for what type of cooking oil that you use personally? Are you a fan of like unrefined extra virgin olive oil that has slightly higher polyphenol count, for example, over refined? Or when it comes to cooking oils, is it mostly about the fat composition?
Yeah, so we actually published research on this. I can tell you my personal after. But we published a review looking at how should we judge edible oils. So everything from butter to olive oil, canola, sunflower, like every single oil, and what evidence existed. And what came out of that is that we've got to look at the ratio of saturated and unsaturated fats in the oil, was one of them. Tocopherols, so a type of vitamin E, one of the 4 classes of vitamin E, and phytosterols, and the polyphenols. So, which includes those bioactives, which is really cool, and it also includes the micronutrients, so it's not just fat. We don't just judge fats based on fats. Basically, we judge it based on the bioactive compounds, the nutrition in them, including the micros and macros. Now, if you were to map that out, there was a paper that came out a few years after ours that actually attempted to map out which oil is best. And the top 2 that came out was extra virgin olive oil and canola. So extra virgin olive oil because of the high phytosterols as well. The polyphenols. And the canola was the high phytosterol content. So it's actually really high in phytosterols. So when you look at the criteria to judge oils, those 2 came out at the top, which is really interesting. So me personally, I grew up in Brazil. We put olive oil on pizza. My daughter does that too. Like, we're eating pizza, we pour olive oil on it. So olive oil for me is, I like the flavor. I like there's different varieties. Like, I'm a Evo girl. But I also use canola or other vegetable oils where needed. It's not my day-to-day. I can, I put olive oil on bread. I own everything. We go through a lot of extra virgin olive oil, but there's a place for all oils. You're predominantly unsaturated oils, right? And the ones that meet that criteria for the vitamin E, for the phytosterols, and for the flavonoids as well. So, but again, at the end of the day, those are the best oils. It's definitely going to be more health promoting than adding loads of butter to your diet. But there's context, right? If having a bit of butter with your veggies is going to make you eat vegetables, like that's great, right? So that context is also really important. But I know people love, what is the best? and the answer really depends, and it's boring. But from a scientific perspective, that's the science on the oils that come out at the top.
Well, this has been super interesting, Flavia. Thank you so much. There's been a lot of practical insights and golden nuggets packed in along the way. My biggest takeaways from this conversation are we should be eating a varied plant-rich diet to optimize our intake of macronutrients, micronutrients, and bioactives. And in doing this, it will ensure that we're getting healthy fats, we're getting important essential vitamins and minerals, and these non-essential but very important bioactives like polyphenols and carotenoids that modulate how we feel in our day-to-day and also affect our disease risk, chronic disease risk. More specifically, we want to ensure that we are getting enough magnesium, folate, vitamin D, zinc, omega-3s, and fiber. The big 6 nutrients that you mentioned are often underconsumed in Australian diets that increase the risk of malnutrition and chronic disease. And at a food level, more mushrooms and get them out in the sun. Get them sunbaking, folks. More colorful plants, including fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. And fatty fish and dairy if you eat animal foods. If you aren't eating these animal foods, then nutrients like calcium, vitamin D, and omega-3s, the long-chain omega-3s, DHA and EPA, become even more important to focus on and may require supplementation. Was there anything that we missed or anything that you wanted to add onto here at the end?
No, I think when it comes to milk, right, because there's such a fear that like, oh, I can't digest it. I think before people totally skip out, if they do have milk, there's other options, right? Try lactose-free, try A1 protein-free. And then if it doesn't work, then look at the alternative, which would be a fortified plant-based milk, and soy being the most protein equivalent. Because that's a big one. Like, you know, it's because it's the most myth-busting one, contentious that I hear. So don't just exit. Don't quit on milk when it's such a highly nutrient-dense food. If you think you just can't digest it or it makes you bloated, there's other options to try before you try quitting it. Yeah.
And I know there's going to be tons of people in the comments, so I have to ask this. Have you ever received funding from the dairy or other food industries? And if so, how do you ensure scientific independence when working on those kinds of studies?
Yeah, so we're at Food IQ with the team that does all this research. We're independent food and nutrition science researchers that then do science communication. And we get a range of funding from lots of different industries. We have gotten from dairy milk producers, from mushroom growers, from grains and legumes. So over time, lots of different funders from government, departments like the Department of Health, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. But what we do is we follow best practice guidelines for industry bias, right? So we like some of these reviews, we identify the question up front, we register the review, we publish irrespective of findings. You can find a paper that we published on whole grain intake and disease risk, and it was no finding, there was no association. That was a big systematic review so we follow not only the guidelines that are recommended for limiting bias in research, but we go above and beyond that. We even make all our data freely accessible so other researchers can access the data and replicate it if they wish. So we're independent researchers. We're kind of filling in that gap and trying to make a connection between science and public health. But we're very proud that we do unbiased science. We minimize the bias as much as we possibly can, to the point that, you know, sometimes our science changes our minds.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
and the outcomes are the outcomes. So if the outcome is negative, if it's industry funded, so be it.
I'll put a link to Food IQ and all the other places that you show up online in the show notes. I really appreciate your time today and everything that you're doing to move the field of nutrition science and public health forward.
Thanks, Simon. It was lovely to chat.